Good afternoon. I will be moderating the afternoon session where we're going to switch gears a little bit and tackle one of the other hot potatoes of contemporary Orthodox life, which is the question of autocephaly. A very hot topic that was recently discussed at Chambézy and is on the agenda for the next meeting this fall. Before we do that, just a couple of comments. I think we have learned from the presentations this morning how rich the 1917-18 Moscow Council and all the historical period and all the preparatory work that was done to prepare for that. But at the same time, we are certainly aware that it is not the answer to all our problems. It took place at a particular time, at a particular place. It answered the needs of that time. And so for us simply to say, our solution now is simply to implement all the decisions and the proposals that came out of that would, of course, be absolutely ludicrous. And if our concern is for orthodoxy here in America, then certainly that is not even part of the heritage of the majority of Orthodox in this country who came either from Galicia, Romania, Bulgaria, the Middle East, Serbia, and so on, who had a very different experience of church life and organization. But obviously the council is important because it did raise some fundamental issues that we all face and that we need to resolve in a way that works best for us here in America. And the intention of this symposium is precisely to begin that conversation, certainly not to solve all of them here and now, although maybe if you put all our faculty together and paid us a few $1 million, we might come up with something which you won't like. Now, my job here is to introduce the next speaker. And again, our topic now is the question of autocephaly. And the first presentation will deal with the question of autocephaly in general in the 19th and 20th centuries as background to the second presentation this afternoon. And our speaker this afternoon is one of a new generation of Russian scholars and church leaders who have really grown up and been developed since the fall of communism. I first met Sergei Havarun as a young layman graduate student who was working for the Theological Commission of the Russian Orthodox Church in Moscow. He was my tour guide when I attended a conference in Moscow. I then met him in Kuala Lumpur, where he was a representative, an official representative to the plenary of the Faith and Order Commission of the World Council of Churches. He has since completed a doctoral degree at Durham. He also has a bachelor's degree from Athens and equivalent of a master's degree from the Kiev Theological Academy. So again, he's a new generation of Russian born both in Russia, or now Ukraine, and also in the West, both in the Orthodox West and in the real West. He now is chairman of the Department of External Church Affairs of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate, and is also professor of patristics at the Theological Academy in Kiev. So again, there is lots of upward mobility for these young Russian scholars and church leaders, filling a real void, because as we all know, there was really a 70-year gap in which very little could be done. And believe me, I've met a number of them, and there is real growth and real life developing in the Russian Orthodox Church. And I think Father Kirill now is one of its leading exponents, and I'm very happy to introduce him. Father Kirill.
Thank you, Paul, for your nice presentation and introduction. Your Beatitude, your eminences, dear fathers, brothers and sisters. In the focus of my paper is a category of autocephaly. What sort of category is it? A student in theology would answer to this question that this category belongs to the canon law. Indeed, canon law considers autocephaly as a way of administering a local church. Literally, it means that a local church is self-headed. This is to say that she elects her own primate who, in consent with local synod, exercises full authority over this church. When considered from the point of view of the canon law, the category of autocephaly is instrumental and technical. It is supposed to help administering communities which are structured hierarchically into a local church. The ultimate goal of autocephaly is to help the church to accomplish her salvific and pastoral mission among her faithful. Does this classical definition of autocephaly explain everything about this category? I think the answer is no. In the real church life, where various cultural and political circumstances and implications play important role, this technical, so to say, category by far exceeds the realm of the canon law. Autocephaly has power to unify or to divide people, churches and societies. Not only church hierarchs, but also political powers get engaged into struggle for or against autocephaly, make it a part of their political agendas, party programs, ideologies. Sometimes autocephaly becomes an issue of international politics. In other words, a technical and instrumental category, which autocephaly theoretically is, in reality gets enormous impact upon the ecclesial, social, and political processes. Thus, in the real church life, autocephaly is not a technical category anymore. It turns into a cultural phenomenon. As a cultural phenomenon, autocephaly is not a constant. It changes and develops in history. It gets different interpretations and connotations conditioned by various cultural, social, and political contexts. In other words, the concept of autocephaly, say, in 4th, 6th, 9th, 12th, 19th, 20th, or 21st centuries are quite different. They had different meanings for their contemporaries and exercised divergent impact upon historical processes. Taking this into consideration, we may assume that there is a modern interpretation of the phenomenon of autocephaly. The question is, what does this interpretation say about autocephaly? When it was born and under what conditions? The category of autocephaly, as we know it nowadays, was to a great extent shaped by the national liberation movements in Balkans in the 19th century. I regard establishing independent national states on the soil of the Ottoman Empire a milestone in formation of the modern concept of autocephaly. The modern concept of autocephaly was inspired by the national sometimes nationalistic ideologies which were initiated at the end of the 18th century by the French Revolution. This concept was born together with national states. Being connected with the idea of nation and national independence, autocephaly became an attribute of statehood for newly emerged national Orthodox countries, alongside anthem, flag, or currency. Without their own autocephalous churches, the national Orthodox states in Balkans did not consider themselves sufficiently independent. They projected their independence from the Ottoman Empire to the independence of their Orthodox churches from the Patriarchate of Constantinople. This explains the enthusiasm of those states in the struggle for autocephaly of their churches. Thus, 19th century has produced a completely new criterion for autocephaly, independence of national state. This criterion continued to work in the 20th century, now mostly in Eastern Europe. Almost all the countries of Eastern Europe with more or less significant Orthodox population tried to get independence for their churches, now primarily from the Moscow Patriarchate. A characteristic feature of the modern concept of autocephaly is that it acts like a myth. Actually, this category itself turned into a myth. When speaking of myth, I do not mean fairy tale, but a system of ideas which go far beyond their original meaning of the concept. It's a complex of views, a complex of understanding, which involves cultural things, cultural backgrounds, linguistic, civilizational, whatever. Nowadays, the category of autocephaly involves many aspects as well, which are irrelevant to canon law or even to ecclesiology. This turns autocephaly into a mythologema. I would suggest that never before in the centuries this category was so powerful, and its power is rooted in the mythical component in it. So, what sort of myth is the category of autocephaly? I will attempt answering this question on the basis of two short case studies, Greece and Ukraine. However different these countries are, and their churches may be, in my opinion, they have essential similarities in regard to the mythic power of autocephaly. This power, however, is in the two cases acts in different ways and brings different fruits. So, Church of Greece. Church of Greece was the first instance of autocephaly in the modern post-French Revolution sense. This instance is paradigmatic in many aspects. It emerged as a projection to the Church of the struggle of the Greek intelligentsia for liberation of the Greek nation. This struggle was inspired by the Greek edition of the European Enlightenment ideology. The Greek Enlightenment ideology, however, had its specificity. Contrary to the French Enlightenment, it was not openly anti-clerical. For instance, Adamantios Korais, the chief ideologist of the Greek Enlightenment, was not disposed against the Orthodox Church, though he had two bold ideas about reformation of the church life. His ideas about the church life were quite similar to the ideas of obnovlency in the 20th century Russia. Actually, Korais was sent to study to France, Montpellier, with the church scholarship, and at the initial stage of his public activity composed theological treatises. Therefore, the ideologists of the Greek Enlightenment did not reject the church, but tried to include her into their ideological framework. Reactions in the church to these attempts were diverse. There were some theologians, like Athanasius of Paros, who completely rejected any attempt to make the church a part of the Enlightenment project. Athanasius became a fervent polemicist against Korais. Enlightenment as an ideology was for him totally contrary to the church tradition. He actually called it philosophia, not exactly philosophia, philia to zophus, love to darkness. At the same time, there were church theologians who attempted accommodating traditional church institutions to the new social and political realities. Among them, I could name an Athonite hieromonk, Benjamin of Lesbos, hieromonk Stephan Dougas, and others. Probably the most prominent theologian of this sort was Theokritos Pharmakidis. He was supporter of the Greek Enlightenment movement. For instance, for a couple of years he was co-editor of the periodical Logios Hermes, which was a chief printed organ of the followers of Korais, of the Enlightenment project. As a member of the Philikia Teria, he supported a liberation of Greece and establishing independent Greek state. He also became a protagonist of the Greek autocephaly. At the initial stage, both independence of Greek nation and autocephaly of Greek church were not something unanimously accepted by the Greek Orthodox hierarchs and theologians. There was either strong or latent opposition to the liberation movements from such prominent theologians and church leaders as, for instance, Kosmas Athanasius of Paros, whom I already mentioned, and some other members of the movement of Calibates. Calibatic fathers were those fathers who, starting from the middle of the 18th century, promoted revival of spiritual life, initially on the Mount Athos, and then after they were expelled from the Mount Athos, they spread around the Greek islands, and they contributed significantly to the revival of the monastic traditions, spiritual values. Actually, they produced such an important book of the Orthodox spirituality as Philokalia. So, they had their own attitude towards liberation movements in Greece, and this attitude was rather negative. So, it's often not stressed by the theologians or historians, but there are indications and proofs that they were in rather an opposition to the liberation movements on Balkans. And Athanasius of Paros, as a member of this Calibatic movement, was one of the most politically engaged, so to say, or ideologically engaged in this opposition to the liberation movements. The patriarchs and other Fener-based hierarchs of Constantinople also had reasons to oppose the Greek liberation movements. Of course, the obvious reason is why they were opposed, because this was a direct danger for the integrity of the ecumenical patriarchate. But it would be oversimplification to say that these reasons were purely political. There was also strong theological and historical rationale behind the Phanariotic opposition to the Greek independence and the Greek autocephaly. The fathers of the Greek liberation revolution and newly born modern Greek nation realized that the people that constituted this nation, the Greek nation, are ultimately religious. Therefore, to make them accepting the revolution and new national and state identity, the liberation movement had to be sacralized, and sort of latent or quite energetic active opposition to the liberation movements in the church, within the church, had to be surpassed through producing through some arguments, some new symbols, which would have also sacral character. So the struggle for independence of Hellas had to be holy and blessed by the church. One of the most popular legends of the Liberation Revolution 1821 in Greece was that Metropolitan of Old Patras Hermanos, on the 25th March, day of Annunciation, blessed the flag of the revolution. The majority of the historians believe, however, that this episode is just a legend. Nevertheless, it has become ultimately symbolical and is propagated by both the state and the church in Greece as a sign of sacrality of the Revolution 1821. For the state, it has become a sacral part of the Greek independence ideology. For the church, it has become a symbol of her contribution to the liberation of Greece. It also became a token that the official church in Greece accepted independence of the Greek state, the new identity of the Hellenic nation, and her own new mode of existence as an autocephalous church. At the sunrise of Greek political independence and ecclesial autocephaly, political and ecclesial things went surprisingly close to each other. up to the point of confusion. To illustrate this, I'd like to mention just one example, which is nevertheless quite striking. One of the earliest official documents which regulated relations between the state and the church in the freshly established Greek kingdom, the decree about independence of the Greek church, the Akyrixis Peritis and Exartisias Thessalonikis Ecclesias, which was adopted in Nauplion on the 23rd of July 1833. This decree states in particular, King is the chief of the church in administrative matters, Article 1. From the ecclesial side, the church is administered by 5 bishops who notably constitute the Holy Synod of the Greek kingdom, not of the Greek church, of the Greek kingdom, Ierasinodos tou Βασιλείου της Ελλάδος. And these bishops, these members of the Synod of the Kingdom, were appointed by the government. This is according to the Articles 2 and 3 of the decree. The members of the Synod, when appointed, need to take oath of faithfulness to the king, not to any other authority, church authority. Pistin εις τον βασιλέα. So such close relations between civil and church authorities in Greece in the early years of its independence indicate that autocephaly here was understood as an attribute of political self-sufficiency and of a distinctive national identity. It actually turned into an ethnic myth. In the modern Greek situation, autocephaly of the Helladic Church becomes more and more detached from the idea of independent state and distinctiveness of the Greek nation. This tendency is reflected in the ongoing discussion about the sense of the Helladic autocephaly, as well as in growing sympathies with the ecumenical patriarchate among even the most conservative, nationally concerned, and even nationalistic circles within the Orthodox community of Greece. Actually, when I studied at the University of Athens, we had historians of the modern Greek Church which just rejected the autocephaly of the Greek Church as something politically conditioned, not really canonical, as something as a terrible mistake of the history. So it was quite bold on their side to consider the autocephaly of the Greek Church in this sense. And so there are really sympathies among the theological circles or church hierarchical circles in the Greek Church, within the Greek Church, with the ecumenical patriarchate, and antipathies to the Greek autocephaly, quite surprisingly. And to illustrate this tendency, this trend which exists within the Greek Church, it would be sufficient to mention the enthronement word of the newly elected primate of the Church of Greece, Archbishop Hieronymus II, who said, today, he stated, on the day of his enthronement, February 16, 2008, more than ever before, the significance and the role of our venerable ecumenical patriarchate for the course of orthodoxy overall must be understood. The Church of Greece, being fully aware of the Hellenic nation's history, of our ecclesiastic history, and of Orthodox ecclesiology, bears a heavy responsibility on her shoulders as regards the manner in which she will safeguard whatever traditionally pertains to her relations with the ecumenical patriarchate. In the 19th century, autocephaly of the Church in Greece has become a paradigm for autocephalies of other Balkan churches. The autocephaly of the Greek Church, as you know probably, it is paradigmatic. At the same time, it has some interesting features like inability to proclaim their own saints. All the saints of the Greek Church are proclaimed by the Ecumenical Patriarchate. Also, the Greek Church gets its mirror from the Ecumenical Patriarchate. So, and also in the statute of the Greek Church, it is stated that the spiritual leader of the Greek Church is the Ecumenical Patriarch. So it's indeed it's a special case on the one hand. In the modern understanding of what autocephaly is, on the other hand, this autocephaly became a starting point, a pushing point for other autocephalies to appear on the soil of the Ottoman Empire. As in the 19th century, the Greek Church became a paradigm, a starting point for autocephalies of other Balkan churches. In the 20th century, in the 21st century, national independence tends to loosen its ties with the idea of autocephaly of the national church. The examples which I have mentioned, they illustrate how the idea of autocephaly is getting detached from the idea of statehood, of national identity in Greece and in some other countries which received their autocephaly in the 19th century. However, this process, this tendency to detachment of the idea of autocephaly from the idea of statehood happens not everywhere. Rather, an exception from this trend is, I think, the case of Ukraine. What is going on in Ukraine with the issue of autocephaly reminds of Balkans in the 19th century, and primarily of Greece with its struggle for national independence and church's autocephaly movement. Many Ukrainian political, public, and church figures regard autocephaly as a necessary accessory of the state independence. During the 20th century, Ukraine has attempted its independence several times. Similar is the number of attempts of autocephaly for the Orthodox Church in Ukraine. Unlike political attempts, ecclesial ones were unsuccessful so far. Many political and public actors in Ukraine are under spell of the myth which the canonical category of autocephaly has turned to. Again, I don't want to say that myth is a bad idea. I just want to clarify, to cleanse it from any negative connotations. It's just a category that acts in a special mythical way in the consciousness of people. This myth acts within Ukraine as it acts within many other cultures, in many other countries. And for instance, many political and public figures in Ukraine believe that autocephaly is a key to solution of the problem of unity of the Orthodox in Ukraine, who are separated into the Orthodox churches in Ukraine. These churches are separated into several groups, which are hostile to each other, unfortunately. Those figures also believe that autocephaly can secure Ukrainian independence, which otherwise is vulnerable. However, is autocephaly an automatic solution to the problems mentioned above? I doubt. In my opinion, in the Ukrainian situation, autocephaly of the Ukrainian Church does not automatically secure reintegration of separated ecclesial groups into one Orthodox Church. It does not secure stronger independence of Ukraine either. When it comes to reality, myth about autocephaly sometimes either stops working or works with unexpected and undesired consequences. This has obviously happened to Ukraine, where pro-autocephaly movements have led to severe church schisms. As a result, the once solid church has separated into three large Orthodox jurisdictions: Of these jurisdictions, only the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, in unity with the Moscow Patriarchate, is in communion with the rest of the Orthodox ecumena. The other two, Patriarchate of Kiev and Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church, are recognized by the worldwide Orthodoxy as schismatic. Autocephalous Orthodox churches are recognized, thus, unlike in Greece, in Ukraine one can see failure of the myth of autocephaly. Other ideas or even myths should be involved to solve the mentioned problems. Actually, I'd like to dwell a bit more on this idea of this failure. We discussed in Ukraine with many figures from all the jurisdictions, including the Patriarchate of Kiev, Autocephalous Church, and so forth. What would be if the Ukrainian Church be granted autocephaly? Would it lead automatically to our unification? And even they agree that it won't work automatically, because the schism, the split, is deeper. It is rooted, it has sometimes other mechanisms. It's a cultural thing now. So it's not, in this regard, if autocephaly, say, be granted to the Ukrainian Church, it would mean that there would remain 3 or 4 jurisdictions in Ukraine, arguing with each other and not finding actually consensus and not willing to be united. So, as I said, other ideas or even myths should be involved to solve the problem of the integrity of the Ukrainian Orthodoxy. Some politicians in Ukraine started realizing this. They proceeded to other solution different from autocephaly. In the 20th century, an alternative to the full autocephaly of the Church has been invented. The Ecumenical Patriarchate has provided this alternative. The Church of Constantinople has created a model of relations with her satellites that does not affect the de facto independence of those churches that have conditional independence, autonomy within the Patriarchate. One of the most important preconditions for this model is relative detachment of the Ecumenical Patriarchate from political powers and political engagements. Turkey, at least, does not try to use its influence upon Fanar to persuade any significant goal on the international level. On the contrary, the policy of Turkey towards the Ecumenical Patriarchate consists in confining its role to the borders of the Turkish state. Such soft attitude of Fanar to its autonomous parts, especially ethnically heterogenic, allowed such states as Finland or Estonia, instead of seeking for autocephaly for their Orthodox churches, be satisfied with the status of autonomous church in the framework of the Ecumenical Patriarchate. The same model was recently attempted by the president of Ukraine, Mr. Yushchenko, who tried to restore a Kievan metropolia under the Ecumenical Patriarchate. This metropolia existed as a part of the Ecumenical Patriarchate before the end of the 17th century, after it joined the Moscow Patriarchate. So this recent attempt to re-establish this Kievan metropolia of Kiev, was undertaken on the basis of the unrecognized Patriarchate of Kiev and the Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church. This model, however, also failed last year. None of the churches in Ukraine, except maybe the Ukrainian Autocephalous Church, agreed to accept this model. Moreover, some considered this model dangerous for the integrity of the country. Indeed, creation of 2 parallel canonical jurisdictions in Ukraine, those under Moscow and Constantinople, would cause serious tensions, up to the point of confrontation and violence between the 2 groups. This in turn would inevitably lead to disintegration and destabilization of the political and social situation in the country. So confrontation between Moscow and Constantinople in Ukraine could have tragic consequences also for the unity of the worldwide Orthodoxy, because it would be practically impossible to prevent a break in relations between the two churches. I don't want to be an alarmist, but this model of normalization of the situation in Ukraine by establishing two parallel jurisdictions could lead to a great schism within the worldwide Orthodoxy. We are lucky that this did not happen so far. What then can be solution for the Ukrainian case? Honestly, I don't know. I know only what would not help the situation in Ukraine. I mentioned the situation as an example of the situation in Ukraine as an example of power and failure of the myth of autocephaly. Nevertheless, autocephaly can work in Ukraine. So this myth, under certain conditions, can be applicable to the situation in Ukraine. A basic condition for this is its demythologization. It should be deprived of any non-theological load which it bears. Autocephaly should not be considered by some as a key to solution of the Ukrainian church problem, and by some as an embodiment of the world evil that would cut off Ukrainians from the universal church and salvation. Actually, there are manifestations often happen in Ukraine when people keep slogans that autocephaly is a way to hell, it's a break, it means break from the universal orthodoxy, from the salvation. So it's absolutely non-ecclesiological, non-theological understanding of what autocephaly is. So when autocephaly would be understood in its initial theological, ecclesiological meaning, it would be a basic precondition for this myth of autocephaly to work properly in Ukraine. In conclusion of my paper, I would like to raise a question whether the American autocephaly includes any element of myth. American autocephaly, in my opinion, is not typical for the 19th, 20th centuries autocephalies. Any national liberation movement did not cause it. Of course, it does not mean that it was completely free from any political context. On the contrary, as it is well known, it was to a great extent conditioned by the Cold War. Nevertheless, politics was never a primarily element in the mythology of the American autocephaly. What then constitutes this mythology? I think mythology of the American autocephaly is connected with an ambition to create a new reality in the worldwide orthodoxy, the reality of self-sufficient local church in a country without many centuries of Orthodox traditions. This church is supposed to be more or less disconnected from the traditional Orthodox societies and incultured in the society which has been shaped by non-Orthodox traditions. It is an experiment to set up a local church which would be embodiment of the Orthodox ecclesiology in its pure form. The experiment of the American autocephaly is called to demonstrate vitality and dynamics of orthodoxy, its essential otherness in relation to the national cultures and the factors aligned to theology. It is called to correct, to make another attempt to create the myth of autocephaly as it was shaped by the national liberation movements of the 19th, 20th centuries. It's a sort of, an attempt to make this correction, to lead this myth which appeared in the 19th, 20th centuries from the deadlock where, in a sense, it is a deadlock because we see the processes of bringing autocephalys from the national ideas in the modern orthodoxy, and the American church, the Orthodox Church in America, is an embodiment of these attempts of liberation, of correction of this initial idea of autocephaly from the national liberation movements of the 19th century. Such vision is embodied in the mythology of the American autocephaly. Although the American autocephaly is not a national autocephaly of the 19th, 20th century, it is not technical either. There is something more behind it than just an attempt to optimize administering a local church. It is a vision of orthodoxy free of temporal factors, theology in its pure form. The founders of the American autocephaly believed that this vision would be so attractive that it would magnetize other jurisdictions on the American continent and propel them to group around the new autocephalous church. This vision would go beyond America. It was supposed to inflame the same processes in the Western Europe. Western Europe would follow the example of America and set up its own local churches, detached, at least jurisdictionally, from their local ethnical traditions. Was this vision brought to the reality? Not completely. However, the myth behind the American autocephaly is still attractive and inspiring. It drives the Orthodox Church in America through difficult circumstances, and it is a source of a power. It makes this church distinctive among the rest of the local Orthodox churches. The worldwide Orthodoxy desperately needs this vision. It also needs the myth which the Orthodox Church in America embodies. Thank you.